Like most boys at that age, my favourite game was Knights and Sorcerers. Of course, there weren't any rules, so it was mostly just a bunch of kids swinging around sticks at each other, but in our minds we were all valiant knights, protecting the mysterious elven sorcerers who stood at our backs. Of course, none of the boys wanted to be the sorcerer, since at that age, none of us knew what sorcerers really did. After all, elves were a rare sight out on the streets. So all the sorcerer got to do was stand there while the knights protected them. And, of course, no girls really wanted to be the sorcerer because boys at that age are just stupid and immature, or so they told us at the time, repeatedly. So that's how I ended up, standing in the pasture swinging a stick at the imagined evil elfbanes while the cows watched on impassively when the girl first appeared. I'd never seen anyone like her before. She looked frail, but moved with a dancer's grace. However, what first drew my attention was the silver hair that, despite being tied up in fancy curls and falling in ringlets down her back, still flowed down past her waist. The second things I noticed were her ears. They were long-pointed, meaning she was an elf. Despite being roughly the same age as me, her expression was strangely serious as she watched, before she finally spoke. "What are you doing?" Feeling a little foolish as I swept my greatsword, which was really just a long stick, back and forth at my feet, I answered her question. "Playing Knights and Sorcerers?" The elf girl was silent for a moment, as if carefully considering my words before she spoke again. "How do you play Knights and Sorcerers?" I shrugged, in the exaggerated way only kids can do. "Well, the knights stand in front of their sorcerers and protect them from the elfbanes." With her head tilted to the side, as if struggling to understand, the girl finally asked, "Can I play?" Of course, having an actual sorcerer to play Knights and Sorcerers with was rare, so I nodded eagerly. "Sure." The elf girl bravely marched out into the cow pasture with me and stood where I told her to, then watched as I fought off wave after wave of the evil elfbanes. After a few minutes of this, she paused me and asked, "What does the sorcerer do?" I could tell she wasn't having any fun standing there, being defended. I wanted to join in on the action, but not knowing what sorcerers did back during the Elfbane Wars, I decided to be honest. "I don't know." Then, realizing that she was an elf, she might know more about sorcerers than any of the local boys, I decided to ask, "Do you know what sorcerers do when fighting?" The elf girl stopped and thought for a moment. "Well, my father can shoot fireballs from his hands, and my mum can shoot lightning from her staff." I couldn't help but get excited. "That's amazing! Will you be able to do that kind of stuff when you grow up?" For the first time, the elf girl smiled, even if the smile was a little uncertain. "Probably, but I can't do anything like that yet. I can only do small spells." Having never seen magic before, even a small spell sounded amazing to me, and I eagerly stepped closer. "Can I see a spell? Even a small one?" The elf girl's smile faltered a little, but she held out her hand and seemed to concentrate before saying, "Vesper." After a moment, I could feel a breeze coming from her hand, as a few strands of loose grass seemed to get caught up in a small dirt devil in her palm. I watched the air spin around and could imagine a giant version of that spinning across a battlefield, picking up and tossing enemies as if they were the little strands of grass. I was grinning like an idiot as I cheered her on. "That's incredible! Can you do any other spells?" The elf girl stopped and thought again, before holding out her hand and more confidently saying, "Shock!" A small electrical pulse seemed to shoot out of the elf girl's hand, and I was just as excited as before. Unfortunately, the nearby cow that got hit by the shock was not nearly as entertained as it bellowed in surprise and began running away from the girl, whose head didn't even come up to its shoulder. As the cow ran, its nearby herd ran with it. Of course, as an old hand in the cow field, it wasn't any issue for me to dodge out of the cow's way. Unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for my new friend, as another of the cows ran straight toward her in its rush to join its herd. The elf girl stood numbly, staring at the cow as it rapidly approached. Realizing what was about to happen, I ran forward and grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her out of the way. Unfortunately, that meant I was now in the cow's path, and it hit me hard, knocking me face first into the nearby fence post. As I turned to check on the elf girl, one of my eyes was blurred with the blood seeping down. Thankfully, the eye itself still worked, but I had a large cut extending above and below it. Evidently, my appearance frightened the girl because she screamed. Before I knew what happened, there was a flurry of motion as several adult elves came running, the one out front bearing arms and armor, the likes of which I've never seen before or since, as he shouted, "Princess! "Are you alright, Your Highness?" Then, seeing she was unharmed, he added, "You know you shouldn't run off like that." The elf girl was trying to point at me, saying, "That boy is hurt." But the adults were only concerned with carrying her away to safety. Turning to all the kids listening to my story, I finished up, and that was the last time I ever saw her. Rather than look suitably impressed at my adventure, one of the older boys made a face. "So you got that scar because a cow ran into you? That's kind of pathetic." I shook my head and chuckled. When I was young, that might have bothered me, but at the ripe old age of 18, I was now above such petty barbs. Well, I prefer to think of this scar as a memento from the time I saved a princess, but I suppose you're not wrong. I paused a moment, allowing him to savour his victory over an adult, before adding, "However, if you're not going to appreciate my amazing tales of daring action and adventure, it's probably high time you got back to mucking out the stables, Henry." I reached down and rumpled the kid's hair as he grumbled and stood up to get back to work. That was a signal to the rest of the kids to break up and get back to their various chores. Looking up as the crowd of listeners left, I saw a cloaked figure turn and walk away. Maybe it was just my imagination still focused on the story I'd been telling, but for just a moment I thought I saw a flicker of silver hair under the cowl of the cloak. I narrowed my eyes for a moment before shaking my head. I needed to get back to the forge rather than letting myself get lost in daydreams of times long past. Walking into the forge, my master, Tarvin the blacksmith, gave me a once-over. "Took your time getting here today." I smiled at him good-naturedly. Some of the kids asked me about the scar, so I decided to tell them the story, and got a little caught up in the retelling. Sorry about that. Tarvin grunted. "Well, just don't make a habit of it. You're supposed to be my apprentice, not a storyteller for a bunch of brats." He was doing his best to give me a scowl, and to be fair, the blacksmith could cow veteran mercenaries with a look when he needed to, but this time the scowl lacked the bite to make it stick. The old man would never admit it, but he was a big softy when it came to kids, and I knew he'd let me off with a slap on the wrist for being late because I was entertaining that bunch of brats. After a few moments, Tarvin's scowl eased into his usual grimace of grumpiness, and he nodded over at one of his latest pieces. "The sword the guard captain ordered is done. Run it over to him, eh? And don't forget to get the payment this time, or I'll send you right back." I chuckled to myself as I picked up the sword in question. I hadn't forgotten to get a payment from a customer since my first delivery years ago, when I had started as an apprentice blacksmith, but he still said it every time. Rushing out the door, I shouted back, "I'll be back in time for lunch." Tarvin's answering shout followed me out into the street. "You'd better be back long before then." I grinned as I set off at a fast walk. Getting a reaction out of the grumpy man was a game to me at this point, and he knew it, but the old man played along like a good sport. Or maybe he just wanted to make sure I didn't follow through with my threat to waste so much time. It was hard to say for sure. Regardless, my spirits were high as I passed by an alley like any other, but my grin faded as I stepped back and looked again. Two large men had cornered a smaller figure in a cowl. One was leaning over the shorter figure, his hands pressed to the wall at the figure's back, preventing them from running as he spoke in a demanding tone. Now, don't be difficult. Come with us. Your brother just wants a word with you, that's all." If this was a family dispute of some kind, I didn't want to be a part of it. I was just turning to walk away when I noticed the flash of steel as the other man drew a knife and started walking up on the figure's other side unnoticed. Realizing this was about to go from a minor scuffle to a murder, I acted before realizing what I was doing, running up behind the two men. They both turned to see who was stupid enough to interrupt whatever this was, just in time for me to swing the sword I was carrying. The sword smashed into the face of the first man, still in his protective sheath, and sent him crashing to the ground, hands covering a face that now featured a broken nose and fewer teeth than a moment ago. The other man started to swing his knife, but before the blow could land, the figure raised its hands and quietly, but clearly said, "Flame wave!" A wave of fire pulsed out from the figure's hands and set the coat of the man with the knife alight. As he struggled to get it off, I punched him in the side of the head. Several years as an apprentice blacksmith had given me more than a bit of muscle, and the man went down quickly. Then, as the first man struggled to rise, I gave him a swift kick, laying him out as well. Looking up, I was shocked to see a face I'd never forget. It was a little over a decade older, just like mine, but standing before me was the elf girl from my story. There were several voices behind us, and I turned, expecting to see the guard coming to investigate the disturbance, but instead it looked like several more thugs were wondering what was taking so long. I felt a hand grip my arm from behind as the elf girl hissed out, "Please, help me get out of here. They're trying to kill me." Realization seemed to dawn on the new thugs' faces, and again I acted without thinking. Turning back, I took the hand of the elf girl from my memory and ran, leading her for a series of back alleys and side streets that only someone who'd grown up in the area would know how to navigate. There was a lot of shouting now, coming from multiple angles, and I wondered where the guards were, before adding on the question of why I'd allowed myself to get swept up in this madness, instead of just making the delivery I'd been assigned. Realizing we needed a plan, I turned to the elf, hoping for some answers. "Where are you running to? Is there someone who can help?" The girl shook her head. "I just need to get out of the city. Nowhere here is safe for me anymore." I frowned. That was going to be a tall order. Thinking quickly, I tried to offer an opinion. "What about the guard? Could they keep you safe?" Shaking her head, the elf answered, "No. The guards here are all in my brother's pocket. At least the officers are. If they get a hold of me, I'm dead." This time I cursed. This was getting worse and worse by the moment. I was struggling to throw together even the barest semblance of a plan. "You just need to get out of the city, right? From there you can figure things out?" The girl hesitated a moment before nodding, though I could see the uncertainty in her face even before I heard it in her words. "Yes, I think so." Sign. I realized that the elf had no idea what she was doing. I could just walk away, and none of this would be my problem any longer. But a part of me rebelled at the idea of abandoning a girl in a situation like this. And not just any girl. This was literally the girl of my childhood dreams. Looking at the girl, I could see she wasn't quite as small as she'd first seemed in that alley. If anything, she might actually be a little taller than me, though her frame was thin enough that I was confident she was not familiar with any form of manual labor. Currently, she was looking around in concern, letting me get a better look at her. She was beautiful, in a way that redefined the word as I'd known it. Sure, I'd flirted with plenty of pretty barmaids, and Eloise, my childhood friend, was objectively beautiful in her own right. But the person standing before me was something else altogether. However, it wasn't her appearance that had tugged at my heartstrings so much, as the expression of despair that was quickly shadowing her face. I knew at that moment that I was going to see this through, for better or for worse. Having made up my mind to stick around, I decided I might as well ask the one question I always regretted never asking as a kid. "Listen, we're going to find a way out of this, but I figure I should at least know the name of the person I'm risking my life for a second time." At that, the elf looked up, surprised. A confused look on her face then melted into the faintest, embarrassed smile as she held out a hand. "I am the Lady Asalia of House Verilion." Unsure of what to do, I took her hand and shook it, though judging by the expression of confusion and surprise, that was not the action she'd expected. I tried to cover up my apparent fumble by introducing myself. "Well, Lady Asalia of House Verilion, I am Lyndon, Lynn for short. No last name or house, just Lind. But I will do my best to get you out of here alive." The smile Asalia gave me this time was a bit more genuine, as she tilted her head in acknowledgement. "Well, Lyndon of no house, to me you seem to have more honour to your name than an entire house of royal guards. It would seem my younger self chose her companions wisely all those years ago." Hearing her speak of our brief meeting as children after years of no one believing me and thinking I just made up the story to make up for getting myself hurt was surprisingly freeing. And what's more, hearing her bring it up like that meant I wasn't the only one who remembered that day. And although I doubted the day had meant as much to her as it had to me, I couldn't help but feel the corners of my mouth tick up a notch. However, I suddenly paused. Something I had thought about just a few moments ago was tugging at my mind in a way that told me it was important, even if I hadn't realized it until now. Thinking back, my mind froze when I thought of Eloise again. In a moment of clarity, I finally came up with an idea that felt a little less suicidal than the rest. Retaking Asalia's hand in a movement so rapid it made her jump a little, I gave her a tug. "Come with me, I've got an idea." Approaching one of the gates out of the city, I kept Asalia a bit behind me. Standing there in a full set of armour, and wielding a pike as well as a sword at her side, was my childhood friend, Eloise. She smiled as I walked up, but held out a hand then shook her head. "Sorry, Lind. No one's leaving the city right now. There's some big manhunt going on, and I'm supposed to turn everyone away until I'm told otherwise." I waved and smiled, knowing that Eloise wouldn't run me through without at least hearing me out first. Admittedly, if I managed to get on the wrong side of her fiery temper, I'd still be in mortal danger, but I was confident that she'd at least give me a head start if it came to that. Hey, Eloise. You remember the story about how I got my scar? Eloise snorted in a very unladylike fashion, her mannerisms totally at odds with her surprisingly stunning features. Of course I remember. You were so embarrassed about getting blindsided by a cow that you made up the most ridiculous tall tale I've ever heard. Then, when you were called out on it, rather than admit what you'd done, you doubled down and told it to anyone who gave you the time of day. I hear you're still spreading the story around to the kids of the city. I grinned, enjoying the fact that I was about to get one over on the girl who was my bully, before we decided it was better to team up against the rest of the city, rather than fight each other every day. Yeah, that's the one. You'll never guess who I ran into today. Asalia, meet my oldest and most trusted friend, Eloise. Eloise, meet the girl from myth and legend, Asalia. For a moment, Asalia started to hide behind me, but evidently the oldest and most trusted friend part sank in, and she must have realized that this was all part of my plan. So instead, she looked up at the other woman. For her part, Eloise leaned forward and squinted, trying to make out the face under the cowl. I couldn't help but grin as my friend's face went through a series of expressions, cycling from surprise to incredulity to confusion, then back to incredulity. She's an elf, and she had silver hair like in your story. Then, as all the pieces fell together, she gave me a disbelieving glare. Wait, she's real? That whole story about you saving some princess from getting run over by a cow actually happened? I gave Eloise my very best shit-eating I told you so grin, as she leaned back and laughed. By the gods, I could not believe it. All this time there really was some silver-haired elf princess. Don't tell me you're here to tell me she's finally come to reward you, and you've really been knighted like you used to dream about as a kid too. Do you have a fancy last name now? Am I supposed to call you Sir or Lord? I shook my head, grinning. No, just the one revelation today. I'm still just Lind. Besides, we both know you'd never call me Sir, even if I had been knighted. Eloise snorted in agreement, but then her laughter died, and her face fell. She looked to Asalia, then back to me before speaking again. Holy hells. She's the one they're looking for, isn't she? This time I sighed and nodded. Yeah, I think she is, which is why I need a huge favour from you. Eloise's face fell even further into a scowl. You want me to let you two out? Do you know what they'd do to me if anyone found out? I smiled half-heartedly at my childhood friend and nodded. Yeah, I do. But listen, Eloise, they're trying to kill her. I don't know how the guard got brought out, but we need to get out of here before they find Asalia. If they get their hands on her, she's as good as dead. Eloise cursed. Damn it, Lind! This isn't some small favour you can pay back just by buying me drinks at the pub later. I stayed quiet, knowing Eloise was working everything out for herself. In the moment of silence, Asalia grabbed my arm again. Maybe I should just turn myself in. I can't ask you and your friends to do this for me. I can't let you pay the price for my mistake again. At that, Eloise snapped her head up and glared at the elf, then at me, taking me in and probably noticing the only thing I had with me, other than the clothes on my back, was the sword I never got around to delivering. Do you at least have any plan once you get out of here? Somewhere you can go? Hearing my words from earlier echoed back at me, I smiled sheepishly. No, not really. So far our plan is to get out of the city, then figure it out from there. Eloise rolled her eyes. By the gods, it's like you never learned a thing growing up. It's a wonder you've lived this long. She paused a moment, covering her face as she leaned on her pike, before looking back up at me. Okay, listen. First you're going to have to knock me out. That's the only way I can buy you any time. Second, when you leave, get off the road and head due east for about a day till you hit the river. Follow that north until you come across a cliffside with a large cave in it. Apparently there's an old war hero who lives out there. They scare the shit out of the captain. Either they'll save your ass, or they'll put you out of your misery. I don't know which, but at least the odds have got to be better than going out and wandering the forest at random. I grinned at my friend. Thanks, Eloise. I owe you one. Frowning at me, Eloise shook her head. No, that makes 23 you owe me, and now it seems like you're never going to be able to pay me back. Her expression softened, and she added, Just promise me you'll do your best to stay alive. I grinned back, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Of course! I'll take you out drinking, and we'll finally start paying back those debts before you know it. Eloise looked like she was about to argue, but Asalia reached out and touched her arm, and my friend started to collapse, forcing me to reach out and grab her somewhat awkwardly to keep her from hitting the ground too hard. I looked over at the elf. The question in my mind must have been obvious because she answered, "I just put her to sleep. She'll wake up within an hour or so." This seemed like a better idea than doing to her what you did to the men in that alley, and we need to get moving. I settled Eloise down onto the ground, then turned and took in the bustling city. That was all I'd ever known, before turning and looking at the elf lady from my dreams, who'd just taken my life and spun it on its head. Well, I suppose it's now or never. It turns out, Asalia knew about as much as I did when it came to travelling in the wilds. We were cold, sore, and hungry by the time we found the river. However, as neither of us wanted to be caught out in the wilderness by whatever was chasing us, after bending over to get a drink from the hopefully clean water, we turned north and kept moving until the sunset. After stumbling about in the dark for a while, we both realised we weren't going to get anywhere, and decided to settle in for the night. We chose a nearby tree to rest under. I was shivering and wishing we dared to start a fire, when I suddenly felt a warm presence push up against me. Looking over, I could just barely make out Asalia as she leaned over into me. I reached out and wrapped an arm around her, drawing her in closer, then chuckled. I could feel her look up at me more than see the movement, as Asalia spoke for the first time in hours. "I fail to see the humour in this situation. If you're half as hungry and exhausted as I am, we're in rather dire straits." Her tone wasn't accusatory. Instead, it felt more like she was hoping there actually was something to laugh about at that moment. Suppressing a shiver, I chuckled again, then shook my head. "Oh, it's just that all my life, I dreamt about going out and having an adventure like this. But you know what the bards always leave out of their stories of standing up to the villains and saving the princess? The cold and hunger. It seems to me that if the bards were a little more honest, fewer people would go out and do something stupid like this." The girl in my arms seemed to draw inward a little, as she asked quietly, "Do you regret helping me?" I shook my head, knowing she probably couldn't make out the motion in the dark. "No, that's the funny part, I don't. I know the odds aren't in our favour. As you so eloquently put it, we're in dire straits at the moment, but I think this is the first time in my life where I felt like I'm right where I should be. As odd as it sounds, this all just feels right." Of course, at that moment, the cold wind blew and I shivered. A moment later, Asalia shifted, pulling herself more into my lap, then taking her cloak off and using it to cover both of us like some sort of blanket. It wasn't enough to keep the cold fully at bay, but when combined with our exhaustion, it was enough, and we passed out with any further shared words. The next morning, I awoke to the sounds of dogs in the distance. That made me shoot up in a way that knocked Asalia out of my lap and onto the ground. She looked up at me accusingly, until she too heard the sounds of the dogs in the distance. With a look at each other, we got to our feet and started running along the river. Or rather, we would have run if we could, but between the hunger, the cold, and our muscles, which were protesting the previous day's hike, the best we managed was a rapid stumble, as we could hear the dogs getting closer. I was so focused on keeping my feet moving and my body upright that I didn't even notice where we were until Asalia spoke sharply. "Look!" Lifting my head, I could make out a large cliff face up ahead, and a little further on what appeared to be a large cave, just like the one Eloise had described. Both Asalia and I hastened our steps, the sight of our goal giving us a final burst of energy. As we drew closer, an old woman walked out of the cave and glared at us. "Who are you? And what kind of trouble have you brought to my door?" Asalia stumbled, which threw off my balance, and we both collapsed in front of the cave. Holding myself up from the ground more by force of will than anything, I looked up at the woman. Her face looked to be in its 50s. However, rather than being bent over with age, as most women that age were in the city, she stood tall and strong, her grey hair wrapped in a bun, to keep it from falling into her cold blue eyes as she glared down at us. It was Asalia who spoke up, rising to her knees as she did so. "Please, we were told there was a war hero out here who could save us." The old woman snorted. "Well, I'm afraid you're flat out of luck. I'm the only one here, and I'm no war hero. And even if I could help, it's not like I'd help out of the goodness of my heart. I don't know who's chasing you or why, but I bet turning you over would cost me a lot less in the way of headaches than sticking my neck out for a couple of stupid kids with not one functioning brain between the two of you." The dog's barking was drawing closer. It felt like we had mere minutes before we were out of options. I too sat up, meeting the gaze of the woman glaring down at us. Realizing that neither of us had much in the way of anything to offer, I rolled the sword off my shoulder, while I'd been numbly carrying it for the last day and a half. The woman seemed to brace slightly before I threw the sword at her feet. "How about that? Will that buy us a little help?" After the barest moment of hesitation, the woman reached down and grabbed the sword, then pulled it out of its sheath, looking it over with an experienced eye. As a blacksmith's apprentice, I'd seen many people examining various tools of the trade, and I could tell by the practiced way this woman was examining, turning, and re-examining the sword, that she was a master of her craft. She had examined countless swords like this before, and knew exactly how to handle the weapon in her hands. After a moment, she resheathed the sword. It's not bad work, I suppose." Then, the woman walked over to us and leaned down, taking Asalia's chin in her calloused hand, turning the elf's head one way then another, as if inspecting a piece of merchandise, as the dogs sounded like they were almost on top of us, before speaking again. "You're a sorcerer, aren't you?" Asalia nodded slightly, though the movement was made awkward by the older woman's iron grip on her chin. Yes, but I'm not very good. I haven't had much practice." The woman let go of Asalia before sighing. It shouldn't take much. Just concentrate as much magic into your hand as you can, then hold it up to me." Asalia frowned, but seemed to focus for a moment before holding up her hand. The older woman reached down and seemed to brush her lips against the back of the elf's hand, inhaling deeply. I glared at the woman, about to accuse her of I didn't know what, when she glanced over at me. "Relax, boy. I'm not into children barely out of their diapers like the two of you. I just needed a little jump start to get going, that's all." A moment later, Asalia fell over. I barely caught her before she hit the ground. More unspoken accusations died on my lips as the dogs broke out of the underbrush, followed by more than half a dozen haggard men armed with rough crossbows and a variety of other crude weapons. Last, a taller man in fine clothing riding on the back of a horse broke the tree line. One glance was enough to tell me he was an elf, and a second glance at his robes and arrogant bearing told me he was likely a sorcerer, one with considerably more experience and power than Asalia. The elf looked from us to the woman, who now stood sword in hand, though it remained sheathed. He sighed, as though this was all beneath him, before turning back to Asalia and speaking. "Lady Asalia of House Virelian, you are hereby ordered to return to the city, where your brother, King Eldwin, awaits your presence at his court." Asalia seemed to recover a bit of her energy, as she glared at the other elf, though her glare lacked any real bite as she was still too weak to sit up without my support. However, that didn't stop her from growling back her answer. "My brother is no king. He killed our parents in a bid to claim the throne, but the nobles will not support him once they hear of his actions." The mounted elf snorted. "My dear Lady Asalia, it is your brother who holds the noble's favour. He may have been made king by his hand, but it is by the noble support that he will rule. But fear not. There is still a place for you at his side. Well, not his side. After all, a royal bride is a fine way to cement an alliance or two." Asalia's face scrunched in confusion, as if she hadn't even thought of this as a possibility. A moment later, she voiced her confusion. "But who?" The mounted elf smiled, though his grin lacked any warmth or comfort. "Duke Varleth!" This time, Asalia's face contorted with distaste. "Duke Varleth? That disgusting slob? But he's so old! And the rumours!" The nameless elf snorted. "Perhaps. His women seem rather short-lived, but he also possesses the second largest army in the kingdom after the royal forces. Don't worry, as old as he is, you shouldn't have to survive too long. A few centuries at most." At that, Asalia paled, and she started shaking in my arms, as though she was now being faced with a fate worse than death. I looked up at the elf defiantly, though I knew there was no threat I could offer that would have any meaning at that moment. Finally, the older woman cleared her throat, drawing attention back to herself. Once everyone was looking, she smiled a flat smile that seemed to indicate more annoyance than happiness. "Well, that's all well and good, but I'm afraid I just accepted these two as my guests for the day. You'll have to wait to pick them up until after their stay here with me." The elf sneered at the woman. "I don't know who you are, but you'd best walk away while you still can, hag." The older woman seemed to stiffen at the insult, then relaxed, letting the tension drain from her shoulders before speaking again. "All right, let me try this again. Listen up!" She raised her voice so she had the attention of everyone present. "It's been a while since I last had to kill a bunch of idiots like you all, and if it's all the same to you, I'd rather not bathe my threshold in your blood today. But if you don't get off my land right now, that's exactly what's going to happen next." The elf seemed to smile before speaking softly, but clearly. "Kill her." Instantly, all 6 men raised their crossbows and fired as they loosed the dogs at their sides. However, the old woman was no longer where they'd aimed. She launched herself forward in an explosive burst of speed that was so fast I had trouble tracking it, directly toward the mounted elf. To his credit, the elf got off a bolt of lightning that should have killed anyone it touched, but it just seemed to splash harmlessly off the woman's torso as she pulled the sword from its sheath and swung in a blur of motion that ended just past the elf's head. As the elf fell from his saddle, the old woman took a moment to breathe deeply, as if drinking the air. Opening her eyes, they seemed to crackle with power before she launched into motion again. The dogs were almost on Asalia and me, and then there was a flash of movement, and the animals were flung to the side. The men tried to reload their weapons as the dogs whimpered into the brush, but after another burst of speed, 2 of them died before they could take aim. This time, as the remaining 4 men took their shots, the old woman stood her ground, swiping 3 of the bolts out of the air with her sword before catching the last in her hand, then flexing her fingers to crush the shaft. Almost as one, the men turned to flee, but then the woman blurred again, and soon we could hear the screams of the dying in the brush, just past the forest's edge. An icy hand gripped my heart as I realized the older woman was augmenting her body with Asalia's and the dead elf's magic. But that wasn't possible. Humans couldn't use magic. Unless... As the woman walked back into the clearing, I stood up, putting myself between the woman and Asalia. The woman glared at me. "And what's this now? You suddenly have a problem with me, whelp?" I glared at the woman, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop her, but determined to try nonetheless. "You're one of the Elfbane." We glared back and forth at each other before Asalia woke up from behind me. "What's an Elfbane?" I turned my head just enough to glance at Asalia, while keeping the older woman in my line of sight. The Elfbane were humans that infused their bodies with magic by hunting and eating sorcerers. In other words, elves. At that, the older woman laughed, lowering the sword that was back in its sheath as she spoke. "Is that how the stories are being told these days? We didn't hunt nor eat sorcerers." But she tilted her head back and forth as if considering something. "Well, I suppose you could say we ate their magic, but death isn't required for that to happen. It's just the easiest way to power up on the field of battle. But that's beside the point. We didn't hunt them down for it. We fought side by side with our sorcerers. We were honored and respected." She walked up to me, giving me a once-over before looking at the weakened Asalia, still fighting to get to her feet behind me. "At least we were until some of the noble elves started getting jealous of the attention we were getting. Apparently they feared we might start claiming noble titles of our own if things kept going the way they were going. So they rebranded us and declared war. The rest is history, or at least one side's version of history." Then, in a move that surprised the hell out of me, the old woman shoved the sword I'd given her back into my hands, staring into my eyes as if weighing something she saw in them, as she added, "And we weren't called Elfbanes either. We were known as the Mage Knights." Then she turned and started walking away back into her cave. Asalia looked up at me as I helped her to her feet, both of us clearly wondering what we were going to do now, when the old woman shouted back at us over her shoulder. "Well, come on then! Looks like you two need a good meal and some sleep before we haul ass out of this neck of the kingdom."